Okay, welcome back, Vintage Gamers, to the metagame overview and preview for Eternal Weekend 2022 and Four Seasons. This is going to be a video intended for an audience that has a general idea of what is happening in Vintage, what the decks typically look like. I'm going to be going over mostly just numbers and trends approaching the big tournaments of the year. If you are interested to hear a little bit more about how the decks work, definitely check out my video from 4 months ago titled Intro to the Vintage Metagame. That video will have a little bit more about how the decks work. This video will maybe talk about some variants that are popping up, things that are departing from the norm, or how the metagame is trending, but not as not a super basic level. So we're gonna jump right in, and I'm just going to go over what's happening in Vintage right now to help you prepare for your upcoming tournaments. Things to note right away is that Four Seasons and Eternal Weekend North America will be paper Vintage events, which have their own set of constraints and metagame influences due to card availability. Also, people just tend to play more outdated decks at those tournaments. That will maybe be addressed a little bit in the video, but not super much. But there will be an Eternal Weekend Europe online, and those online events tend to follow the typical MTG posting, copy paste of the best lists that you normally see in, like, say, a PTQ. So right now, what you're looking at, if you haven't seen this before, is the metagame dashboard, run and helped by a bunch of players in the Vintage Magic Online community. What we do is we watch the replays at the end of challenges, compile all of those decks into spreadsheets, and perform magic and have it all appear in front of you right now. Right now, you're looking at the data since the release of Modern Horizons 2 on 6/1/21, which is more than a year ago now, almost a year and a half. So this is a very large combination of data, almost 62,000 matches of Magic. Now, we're going to probably look at some smaller subsets of data today, just so you can see trends. Note that when you take smaller subsets of data, your win rate is likely less accurate. Here, you see confidence, 95% confidence intervals down somewhere around 1 and 2%, which can give us a pretty accurate look at how decks are doing. But 1 and 2% is actually a pretty big deal. The difference between 55% and 53% in win rate is quite dramatic. And obviously the difference between 51% and 49% is winning and losing. So what you're going to see is over the last year and a half, the metagame is extremely balanced. There are decks that are performing well. And overall, the tinker-based decks are the ones that are performing the best. But different archetypes inside of different sub-archetypes inside of the high-level archetypes of, like, shops and bazaar and fair decks are performing well. Things like Hogak and Doomsday is not a tinker-based combo deck. Luris, Deathrite Shaman, these kind of decks are performing well inside of the metagame. What we're going to start by looking at is the 90-day metagame. I like 3 months. I think that's a good number where you're still going to get 10,000 matches worth of data, which is not bad. But you are going to see, more recently, like, things that were played in the beginning of Modern Horizons 2 just don't even see play anymore. Things like Sedgemoor Witch Tinker. That deck is completely gone. But that deck was played substantially for a good 3-month period. So what do we have? What we have is the most played deck on Magic Online in the last 3 months is Breach. And we just did a recent data reclassification. For the most part, this Breach is only going to encompass Grixis Tinker Breach decks. There will be some small other variants of, like, Dragon Rage Channeler Breach decks. But I have actually separated the Jeskai Luris Breach decks, which is a brand new thing. We'll get into that a little bit later, out and they are actually inside of the Jeskai category now. So 183, the most played deck on Magic Online is Breach. And the reason is because Breach has been performing extremely well. 54% win rate. Breach has shown to be the premier way to play Urza Saga in a Tinker Shell. And I go over that a lot in my Urza Saga video, But because Breach can use Urza Saga as a combo tutor piece, it gets a substantial buff. You can actually see we did a recent data reclassification where we have separated out Grixis Saga decks, Esper Saga decks, other Saga decks, other Tinker decks, as well as Breach decks. And of these decks that have significant play rate, I would say Breach, Grixis, and Esper, you are seeing Breach come out on top. Grixis Saga decks without Breach in them have actually been performing extremely poorly. Now, these decks you'll see in a lot of places. Decks, Budakov is one who likes to play that online a lot. A lot of the Japanese players play these like 4 Ragavan Tinker Saga decks. But the Tinker Saga deck that is performing the best over the last 3 months, and now there are some new ones to talk about. We'll talk about those too. But over the last 3 months are these Breach Tinker Saga decks, and they are the most played as well, which is, this is substantial. The fact that the most played by a significant margin over the 3rd, 4th, and 5th most played is performing at a very, very high win rate is something to keep an eye on. Now, Hogak is also a very large meta share and is not a bad win rate at all. 51% for Hogak at 160 pilots. Like, you're looking at those numbers. If we go to Hogak, you're seeing 10% of the metagame with this is what happens when you get smaller data sets. This could be as high as 54%, but it could be as low as 48%. We don't really know. All we have is what we have in front of us, right? But we are seeing large numbers of Hogak and decent win rates. One of the things to note about Hogak is there is a new variant of Hogak that is seeing success, and I would say is maybe the best version of Hogak. What Canister and a few other pilots did was added serum powders and added 4 main deck Cradle. And what this does for you, in combination with your free Root Wallas and Hollow ones, is sets you up to play lots of turn 2 Collector Oof. They identified that maybe Tinker or these Tinker decks was a problem for the deck, even with 4 Vigors. And so you're looking at ways to play turn 2 Collector Roof. So things like Cradle, Gaia's Cradle, and Yavimaya, which turns your Bazaar into a green source. Both of those are going to let you play Collector Roofs on turn 2. This also lets you do some other things like playing Hex Drinker to beat fair decks. And what Cradle will really do for you is insulate you against one of the main ways that people interact with the broken Hollow One strategy is Tabernacle of the Pendril Veil, which a lot of times is, Plague Wind on turn 1. Opponent plays 12 free power, you play a Tabernacle, all the power dies. But now you have a lot of capabilities to play around that. A Cradle is going to pay for all those Tabernacles. So something to keep an eye on is how opponents choose to build Hogak. There are just like a couple tweaks here and there. You can play Bloodghast, you can not play Bloodghast. But I personally think the Cradle variant is very interesting, and if I owned Bazaars in paper, I would be interested in maybe trying that for Eternal Weekend. Now, the de facto workshop deck that has been in the last 3 months is Prison Shops. Still a very high metagame percentage, 7%, and actually doing very well. What I do on my Patreon, I don't ask anyone to subscribe to my Patreon usually, but if you do want to support me, that is like one of the best ways because they take way less money. And what I do as a gift for $5 subs is I put out a weekly metagame recommendation where I basically go in here and do the hard work for you. I check out what's happening in the last month. I check out what happened in the last weekend, and I tell you what's performing well and what I think you should maybe play in the next week. For a long time now, what I like to do is say, this is what I think is the best Bazaar deck for the week. What I think, because people don't want to always play, the best deck. They want to play the best deck that they enjoy. So I give, a Bazaar deck, a Shops deck, a fair blue deck, and an unfair blue deck. And so the best Shops deck that I've recommended for many weeks now is actually these Prison Shops variants. And there are a couple good pilots pushing the archetype forward, making changes. And it's showing 51% is good. It is the only workshop deck that is performing at a high level in the last 3 months. But it's 7% metagame share, 3rd most played deck, and still up there with the 51% win rate. So if you are interested in playing a workshop deck, that is proven, because I have some fun workshop variants, but a proven workshop deck, Prison Shops, the Golos stacks is what some people will call it. That's the way to be. Grixis Saga, a deck I don't recommend. I don't see a compelling reason to play a Grixis Tinker Saga deck without Breach. I think Breach is going to add a significant upside, and you can even build your Breach Tinker Saga decks, more heavily focused on Saga. You can play Vault Key, you can play Top. There's a lot of variation that you can make in those two archetypes. But Grixis Saga is basically a Tinker Saga deck that does not play Breach combo, and those decks have not performed super well. Of course, like this, you're looking at small metagames percentages, so like it could be good, and I think it's fine. Like any deck playing Tinker Citadel is inherently going to be strong enough to play at a tournament. Even if you're including some really sketchy cards, Tinker Citadel will bail you out. This has been true if anyone has watched my videos on my channel for years now. Just like Ancestral can make any random pile of blue cards work when you cast it, Tinker can also do the same. Now an interesting one, the fifth most played deck is Jeskai, and we are in a period of time where Jeskai is actually resurging into the metagame. Jeskai had a very dormant past year. The printing of Modern Horizons 2 and Urza's Saga ruined the old builds of Jeskai. Those decks did not adjust to the new metagame. And it was something that people were lamenting. They were like, we need to get Saga restricted so that fair Jeskai decks can come back. And my opinion on the subject was always, I think if you just add Wasteland, you're going to be fine, guys. Just add Wasteland. And no one did it until Noxtom did it. And Noxtom is a name you might recognize from Magic Online, a very, very proficient fair deck player. And what they did was they added Wastelands to a Lurrus Jeskai deck, so a little lower to the ground, and immediately started crushing tournaments. Just immediately, like tournament after tournament after tournament, like 60-something% win rate. Extreme success playing a fair Jeskai deck with Lurrus. And people took note. People were like, oh, this is what we need to do. Maybe we can build on that. And so now you're actually seeing a couple variants of Jeskai. You're seeing Jeskai with Lurrus with Wastelands. You're seeing Jeskai without Lurrus with Wastelands. So just like old school Dak Fade and Mentor. And that deck is actually, that deck has been popping up a fair amount. A couple of Japanese pilots have been trying that deck. And then you're also seeing Jeskai with Wasteland and a Breach kill in a Lurrus deck. So you're playing your Jeskai control deck, but you also have this backdoor Breach combo. That's something that is actually a little like kind of on the old school side, where lots of Breach decks used to play Lurrus, but the problem with those Breach decks is they get hit by Leyline of the Void really hard, because you're using your Dread Horde in your graveyard, and you're using maybe a Mystic Sanctuary in your graveyard or something, these kind of things. Though you just got a new printing for Third Path Iconoclast, which is like a young Pyromancer, might be a way to skirt around the graveyard. Anyways, what I'm saying is there are 3 different Jeskai decks being played right now. The consensus is not out on which one is the best. I personally like the idea of having a backdoor Breach plan in your fair deck so that you could maybe have some Oopsai win against Dredge, something like Dredge. But Jeskai is on an upturn, and some of the things I've been recommending for fair blue players recently have been Lurrus based fair decks. So that might mean Jeskai with Wastelands. That might mean the 4 or 5 color Lurrus Deathrite variants. Those don't see a ton of play, the Lurrus Deathrite variants, but they do perform really, really well. It's hard to say if that's because of the pilots that are choosing to play that deck. That's a little bit more up to interpretation. But in the fair decks, like Jeskai is probably the one that is seeing the most play right now. Dredge has taken a significant metagame hit, mostly due to the fact that Hogak is the main deck for Bazaar players. Hogak adds a lot of flexibility in your hands that you can keep. You're not, you're not always have to mulligan to Bazaar, which is a really nice upside. And also the newest Hogak decks, the ones with those cradles, aren't really susceptible to graveyard hate. They are playing 4 Vengevines, and maybe that's it in the graveyard. Maybe they played like 2 Hogak, but they actually are decks where I'm not even boarding in Leyline against those decks. I'm not even boarding in Tormod's Crypts against those decks because the range of effectiveness is just really minimal. And so when the Dredge deck gets hit by all of these crazy strong graveyard hate cards and the Hogak deck doesn't, like, that's going to move people off it. Now, Dredge is still Dredge, and Dredge is also a really strong like budget option for vintage players in paper. Like just owning Bazaars is most of the cost of the deck. So if you can get someone to loan you Bazaars, then you can only, pay a couple hundred for the rest of the Dredge shell. Don't know if that's true. I don't check card prices. Don't quote me on that. But I know historically that was true. And Dredge hasn't had a great time. It's not, putting up horrible numbers. These numbers are skirting right around 50%. So Dredge is basically a very viable choice. But it's always going to depend on what your opponents are doing in terms of counterplay. And one of the biggest problems with Dredge is also it just kind of gets hit by stray bullets, like a Saga deck. Sometimes they'll main deck a needle, a pithing needle, and sometimes you just happen to draw it. Or the fact that Tinker decks have these oops I win buttons, like they have Vault Key, they have Tinker Citadel, and normally in Dredge you are really hoping to get the game 1 win. Now you're not always going to get that, which is going to really hamper your success. Doomsday. Still, these are pretty, hefty meta shares all the way down to probably 4-color walkers, which is where we'll probably stop. And then we'll go over the other things just casually. But Doomsday is what I think is the premier combo deck of the format. Obviously, doesn't have the highest win rates compared to other things right now, but it's 53% is definitely a significant win rate. And this is basically the only combo deck that truly forgoes artifacts and really plays around artifact hate really well. And that's not 100% true, because Black Lotus is sometimes an integral combo piece, and so Collector Roof can help slow that down, but it's not like you're playing Tinker, right? And I recommend Doomsday for anyone who doesn't really want to play artifact-based combo. And you also get rewarded by the fact that you don't need to own all the Moxen in paper. You only need Sapphire and Jet, which are probably more expensive Moxen. But anyways, Doomsday, I still think, is a super, super strong deck. The cards you need in Doomsday to go off don't feel like they hurt you so much. It feels very easy to do so. And the deck is just a well-oiled machine, just churning through cards. It plays the most cantrips of any deck. It plays the most counters of any deck. It plays Street Race, so the deck size is, theoretically smaller. And it's just wild, the consistency that deck brings. So Doomsday, a premier combo deck in the format, especially nice when you're trying to dodge people who are interacting with artifacts. After Doomsday, we have a different Saga variant, the Esper variant. Now, this is played a lot less than Breach and Grixis Saga, but it is a deck that I think is much better positioned than those two. I think if you are trying to win a Saga mirror, one of the best ways to do that is with things like Lavinia and Opposition Agent. Prismatic Ending can be kind of nice. Swords of Plowshares is great against Hogak. That's the one thing I really wanted to see when I separated the Saga. So all my Saga data used to be in one column. When we separated it between Breach, Grixis, and Esper, what I really got to learn is that typically what you're going to find from the Esper-based Saga deck is that you are going to have a better Hogak matchup. And now that should make perfect sense, right? You are playing Swords to Plowshares, you are playing Lavinia, and you have a Hogak matchup that is right now trending at around 66%. Now, this data is even more volatile because we only have data from the beginning of the year. But when you look at something like 66% win rate for Esper Saga against Hogak, and then you're looking at something like Grixis Saga, and you're seeing a 43% win rate, Esper Saga is the way in a Hogak metagame you would want to build your Saga deck. So, And you're also seeing, Esper Saga winning heads up in the matchup versus Grixis Saga as well. So those are both things that you need to take into account. I don't think the Esper deck plays particularly different from the Grixis deck, but it's going to have different matchups where it's good. And that's something to keep in mind if you are trying to decide what version of Urza's Saga you want to play for this event. Not a problem that I'll ever have, but problem you could have. Bug has fallen off a cliff. Bug has never been a deck that I have been particularly fond of, and I think this is kind of a long overdue showing. The biggest problem with Bug is it's looking for a very targeted Tinker Dredge metagame, because of its cards are such a low power level that they need to be good in the matchups. They need to always be good. And Bug, I don't know what the solution for Bug players is. In my mind, I think the solution for Bug players is to switch to these Luris decks that have a bit more flexibility, a bit more power. But Bug has just not been performing super well. But it's a deck you're gonna see. Like, people are going to still play Bug, even if it's not doing super well. Ooh, Oops All Spells. Yeah, that's a deck that has some like high profile recent finishes, but is a deck that overall does very poorly. What I actually think is that Oops All deck is a deck with very high skill expression and skill ceiling, which is very odd for people. People don't take that comment very well. People are like, the Oops All Spells is the easiest solitaire deck in the format. And it's because it has a high floor. It's very easy to go, these are my cards. Oops, look at the cards. But there's an edge to be gained by understanding the other opponent's vintage decks, understanding matchups, understanding what hands you need to keep. A lot of the Oops All Spells skill expression is inside of mulliganing, choosing, is this actually something that's going to win me the game against what my perceived opponent is going to be doing? And you see this with pilots like Medivh, who has put up more consistent Oops All Spells numbers than some of these other players. A deck to look out for. The newer cards in this deck have definitely made it much more powerful than it has been in the past. Those flip spell lands, make the deck much more comfortable. It is a consistent deck, but it is a fragile deck. If you hit this with any of the hard graveyard hate, things get really difficult. They need to board in Charbelchers to try to skirt around graveyard hate. You start playing Needle. Like, it really suffers from the fact that Needle is one of the most ubiquitous. That's the right word? Might be the right word. Pieces of interaction in sideboards, where that's like the best card, one of the best cards against Bazaar of Baghdad, also going to come in against Charbelcher. So if you're playing something like Ley Lines and you have an opening Ley Line, it's very hard for your Oops All Spell opponent. They're going to have to look for a Charbelcher kill, or maybe they're going to try to Chain of Vapor your Ley Line, and it just gets very difficult. So if you have the requisite hate for this deck, it's very easy to beat, is how I would say. Pio, my boy Pio. Pio has been quietly putting up good numbers on Magic Online, but very small numbers on Magic Online. People have not chosen to play Pio as their Tinker deck of choice. This could be because there's a lot of Hull Breachers running around the metagame. Maybe the deck feels bad to play, but the numbers don't lie. It's not that Pio is underperforming. It's just that Pio is not being played. And this might surprise people who play vintage leagues where there are many, many, many PO pilots. A vintage league, you could have four matchups versus PO. But then you go to a challenge and there's two PO pilots in a 60-player metagame, and you're like, what the hell is going on? And the answer is, I don't know what's going on. I think PO is great. I think you can build the deck in any way to play against any metagame. You have a lot of versatility in deck building for PO. It's a deck I probably expect to play unless something drastically changes. One of the nice parts about PO is you don't have to play Saga. You can play Saga, but you don't have to. It's been proven. It's not just me. Other players are doing this, I swear. And what you gain by that is you gain an advantage in the Saga mirror, like a Tinker mirror, where you don't have to invest mana into that thing. If they are investing mana into constructs, you get to play Dress Down. If people, I heard about a player who played a Sagaless PO deck yesterday to a top 8, and one of their opponents brought in Alpine Moon to beat Saga, and there was no Sagas in the deck. You gain these kind of advantages, but that's not to say you can't play Saga and PO, and Saga PO lists are also like probably the majority of this data and also doing fine. So PO, just everyone knows about PO pretty much at this point. It's just another Tinker variant. It's a more compact deck, a more streamlined deck than these Saga piles. But it suffers from variance pretty hard. When you play a bunch of Mox Opals and you draw a bunch of Mox Opals, it's really sad if you don't draw the right number of artifacts in comparison to the right number of payoff spells. The deck is streamlined, but it has inherent variance in its game plan, which turns people off. So I expect to see more PO played in both the Eternal Weekends in paper and online. And then 4-color Deathrite we'll do there. 4-color Deathrite, yeah. Another fair deck of choice. This is a very popular deck in Japan, mostly I would say because of world champion Yuta Takahashi's influence. That's a deck that they always choose to play and continually do well with because they are an extremely talented magician. But it is a 4-color Walker's deck that is based around Deathrite Shaman to accelerate and use Wastelands. You got Ren and 6 Oko, Minx and Boo. Minx and Boo, nice addition to that deck. That card closes games fast. And that is actually a huge problem with these fair decks, is you can stop your opponent. You can use your double force and stop your opponent from doing anything. But if you don't kill your opponent fast, you end up with some hard times. So a nice addition to that deck. And I actually think it makes the deck quite a bit better. I still prefer the Luris decks, Jeskai and 4-color, 5-color Luris, over the Walkers in terms of fair decks, but I wouldn't fault any fair player for registering 4-color Walkers. I would probably try to tailor the build and have cards in it that suit your playstyle, because it's really a playstyle thing. Something to note is that Nox Tom Jeskai didn't play counter spells, played only permanent base removal. There weren't Flusters and Pyroblast, but that is not how most people play Jeskai. People want to have this spell-based interaction. And then on the other end of the spectrum, Yuta Takahashi 4-color Deathrite Shaman didn't play removal spells. It didn't play Lightning Bolt. It didn't play anything like that. And people were so confused when they're playing their Walker deck and they don't have any removal spells. So you need to make sure that you tune these decks to your playstyle and make sure you're playing to the way the cards you have in your deck. There's a variety of other things we'll just quickly touch on that are all small metagame shares. You might see them. Oath, a deck I don't expect to see much in paper or on Magic Online, but we saw a lot in the Japanese paper event. It's a deck that's doing fine. More of controlling Oath decks exist in the format, but they don't see a ton of play. Squee may show up more in paper just because it's another one of those bizarre decks that are not, prohibitively expensive. The problem with Squee is it's so bad against Hogak that it's hard to justify playing Squee. But Squee can be quite good against these combo-oriented decks, which is, Squee is more of the blue counterspell-based Bizarre Baghdad deck. Aggro Shops, like I said, the other two Shops decks have kind of dropped off the map. Most people are playing Prison Shops, but in a paper tournament, you're definitely going to see people register their tried and true Workshop aggro deck. Pack your Hercules Recall if you're a combo deck. Pack your Shattering Sprees if you're a fair deck. I wouldn't be too concerned. And yeah, there's some mono white decks and some combo shops decks floating around. We talked a lot about Luris Deathrite Shaman. It's not a deck that's played a lot, but basically it's a kind of a Force of Vigor deck, a deck built around Deathrite Shaman. But you get to use the power of Luris. You are a Wasteland deck. You have to forego Oko is the big one you really have to forego playing. But instead, you're still playing Collector Roofs and you play a bunch of Vigors and a bunch of spell-based interaction. So that's what the metagame is looking like these days. What we will do a quick check-in right now on is I actually have all the data from Eternal Weekend 2022 in Japan. Thanks to the fact that the tournament organizers over there used MTG Melee, we actually have all the deck list and all the placings from that event. So I think we should just go over them because it's pretty important to see what was going on in a paper event of this size. I've taken the data from MTG Melee, fixed some of the names, and put it into our typical data sheet here for Magic Online. I'm not going to be merging this data into the Magic Online data. I think paper and Magic Online data should probably stay separate. The constraints are so much different. But I think it's good to be able to look at this and visualize this and make decisions from it. So we had 103 players in Nagoya, and they chose to play mostly things that are prevalent on Magic Online. So you're going to look at this. Let me just lower the thresholds here so that we can see more decks. Pretty wide metagame. Lots of different decks were chosen. Only the highest metagame share was only 10%, which is actually what I showed you here when I had the 3 months metagame. The highest share was Hogak at 10%, something like that. Very similar from online to paper conversion here. Most played decks were Breach, Grixis Saga, and Hogak, which are the same 3 most played decks on Magic Online, or at least, give and take. Those 3 decks are always in the top 5. And you saw pretty similar things in win rates here compared to Magic Online. Breach had an outstanding tournament in Japan. Breach, 60% win rate. The most players, just a crushing tournament for Breach. Having, the most pilots and having 49% win rate is pretty within range for Grixis Saga and Hogak. And Dredge predictably did not do well into this field with a lot of Hogak. You're not seeing any super crazy numbers here, but you did see, Dredge, Doomsday, and Prison Shops near the top, which is very normal metagame comparison-wise. Prison Shops actually had a pretty good day in this field, 54% win rate, one of the better performing decks. I do think that I like Prison Shops enough as the Shops archetype to be pretty happy recommending it to people. I think you are gonna, you're gonna have the same Shops problems that you always have, where if you're on the draw and your opponent Tinker kills you, it's sad. But a lot of times your hate and your prison pieces line up really well against the current combo decks of the format, especially Doomsday. Some weirder things to note is like a really high percentage play of 4-color Deathrite Shaman. Like I said, Japanese players typically tend towards this 4-color Deathrite Shaman as their fair deck of choice. And it actually had I actually made a mistake. The 4-color Deathrite Shaman is the 4% win rate. The Prison Shops was a 51% win rate, that makes a lot of sense as well. But yeah, like this had a pretty good day. I don't know if I still don't know if I'm the biggest fan of the 4-color Deathrite Shaman decks, but it's definitely a fair deck you could choose to play, and not be you definitely want to practice it. But it's definitely a viable choice. Some of the weirder things you see, like 6 Oath players, that is just not normal. Oath is not like, this is what Oath is. What do we say? Oath was a 6% meta share in this tournament. That's not normal. Oath is usually like a 1 or 2% meta share. But there are definitely a bunch of like very dedicated Oath players in Japan. So this didn't surprise me, but it's definitely something that sticks out in the data. Then you see a variety of other decks. When you have a tournament this big, you're going to get a bunch of people playing Brews. So you have like random other Tinker decks, random other aggro decks, and then some Oops Out Spells players. Some things of note in this tournament. The second place deck in this tournament was a mono white aggro deck featuring Dungeon Initiative cards. I have a video going out on my channel. It'll probably be out Friday. But if you want to see that deck in action before then, you can check out Andy Montolio's YouTube channel. Maybe 3bin University has a video. That deck definitely has legs as a white aggro deck. This deck was actually super budget too. Didn't have a Black Lotus, didn't have a couple Moxen. Pretty impressive showing. The tournament was won by Jewel Shops, which is like kind of a fringe all-in PO combo deck that uses Mishra's Workshop. A deck to keep note on, but not a deck that shows up in a lot of players. But it is a really all-in, crazy, powerful artifact-based combo deck. I think the one thing I haven't mentioned yet is there's one more thing I wanted to talk about. Other Tinker has a deck that is showing up a lot, and it is something to keep an eye on. It is blue black. What is trying to clear all of this? I don't know. Okay, here we go. Blue black Tinker is showing up quite a bit in the last few weeks. It's very much a recent thing. But I was experimenting with it. You've seen a couple videos on my channel with Shieldred. Shieldred is very good in the format. People taking damage from drawing cards is very good against actually most decks, because It's good against Bazaar. It's good about, well, maybe not Dredge Bazaar, but it's good against like the non-Dredge Bazaar. And so this deck is like probably really good in the mirror. The deck plays things like Opposition Agent, Hull Breacher, and Shieldred, which are all cards I would consider to be maybe mirror breakers. And so maybe like a more tuned version of like the Grixis deck, which is pretty interesting. Something to keep an eye on. Not something to be overly concerned about. I don't think it'll be a huge meta share, but you may see it. It's definitely had good success in a couple weekly challenges. Okay, I've talked for a while. I hope I've covered everything that people wanted to hear about the current metagame. Of course, feel free to comment on this video and ask questions. I will try my best to address them. Hope everybody has a good time and great luck in the upcoming 4 seasons in Italy, Eternal Weekend on Magic Online and in Philadelphia, and for a whole new season of Vintage on Magic Online to come. They have just announced that there will be Vintage as a MTGO showcase event in Q1 of 2023, and 2 Vintage RCQs are already on the schedule. So more crazy Vintage action to come later next year on this channel. I hope to see you then. Until then, new Vintage videos Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Good luck.